What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Invincible. Yes, we are. We are continuing the Viltrumite war, and I left you guys on one heck of a cliffhanger last week. But this basically picks up in the aftermath of that, right? So Mark just in complete and total shambles. Conquest is dead. Nolan and Oliver are currently on the planet, and then of course you've got Tech Jacket and you've got Alan, who are just kind of out there doing their thing. So by and large, this kind of group of 5 guys, right? This group of just powerhouse characters is just really kind of left in shambles. And so the result of this is that when you end up having, end up transitioning to Telestria, which again is the home of the coalition of planets, this kind of band, something akin to like the Rebel Alliance or what have you from Star Wars, who are basically working together to try to take out the Viltrumites, that you have the news that's given to the head of the coalition of planets, right? And he immediately freaks out. Now, the funny thing about this is Thaddeus, again, is a Viltrumite. So that's one thing to bear in mind. It's something that almost nobody knows, and rightfully so, right? I mean, how likely would you be to follow a guy who's leading a war against a race only to find out he's a member of that race? That it would be something of a huge amount of distrust that's there, because it's like, well, how do we know he's actually working against the Viltrumites as opposed to for us? It's a very dangerous game that he's playing here. The other big thing about this is that when he's given the news that presumably, or at least it's perceived to be, that Nolan and Oliver and Invincible are dead, albeit in reality they're simply just missing in action, because there's no real way of knowing what happened to them, what their fate is, it terrifies the hell out of Thaddeus, because the reality is they're the linchpin, right? They're the linchpin to the success of this thing. It's one thing to unite a whole bunch of people against a particular cause, but if at the end of the day there's not really much they have in the way of arms and armament, then it would be like when the Ethiopians were fighting the Germans during World War II, right? Spears and arrows versus tanks. You're not really going to be able to do much, and that was really what's going on here without their heavy hitters. They can fight as best they can, but the Viltrumites are nothing to scoff at, and one Viltrumite is more than enough to handle a huge amount of these forces, let alone an entire army of Viltrumites, not to mention anything of all the forces they have conscripted to their service. Now, the reality of this is Tech Jacket and Alan are actually stowing away the Viltrumite ship, right? They're stowing aboard this ship, basically the way that Han Solo and them stowed aboard a Star Destroyer, right? You guys remember that from Star Wars? And literally Tech Jacket's like, I saw this in a movie once. So it works, right? It does its job. But you kind of switch over to Nolan and to Oliver, basically dealing with Mark. Now, one of the funny things about this is that you basically have Nolan who buries Conquest, and the immediate response of Oliver is, this is ridiculous, right? Like, you have no idea the kind of things this guy's done. This guy does not deserve a funeral. But the reality of this is that the lifetime of Conquest seems to have spanned thousands of years. And so the reality is that the things that he's done in the time that Oliver has known him basically tantamount to a couple minutes within our lifespan. It's an exceedingly short amount of time here. Not only that, Nolan really kind of hits at this idea that when it comes to the Viltrumites, the one thing that really seems to reign supreme is duty and honor. And so even though Conquest was, by our standards, a villain, in terms of how he operated within the confines of the Viltrumite Empire, he was a great warrior. And so it's one of these things where Nolan kind of looks at that and says, even if he did some shady stuff, he still deserves a warrior's funeral, because he was a great and honorable fighter, even if only insofar as how he operated within the confines of the Viltrumite Empire. Now, this is huge, because it's not Nolan defecting back to the Viltrumites and saying, yeah, I mean, I've seen the light and the Viltrumites are the way to go, and then kills Oliver and then kills Mark and leaves, right? That's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about one of these things where, despite the fact that Nolan has basically turned against the Viltrumite Empire, there are such things as duty and honor that are universal, that are universally recognized as being great things, regardless of what side you're fighting on. And so it's also kind of this concept that's not really given to us, it's not really stated specifically, but Conquest was raised within the ideologies of the Viltrumite Empire. Imagine what he would have been capable of if he had turned in the same capacity Nolan had, or if he had been raised by a different race but still had the same powers and had a different set of values, right? Good and evil, right and wrong is all really relative. Those concepts simply exist in relation to how we function as an organized society. But you end up having them kind of switching over, really traveling back to Mark to keep an eye on him. And of course, they don't really leave him, they just kind of stay with him, but it's going to be a long and arduous process, because what Nolan says is that Mark's going to take months to recover. Now again, Viltrumites can heal, but because Mark is such a young Viltrumite, presumably with hundreds if not thousands of years ahead of him, assuming the human side of his physiology doesn't kick in and basically cause like a rapid aging process relative to the age of Viltrumites, then this is basically him as a baby recovering from an injury, whereas somebody like Conquest recovered much faster because he's much older, right? Now you would think as time goes on the healing factor would kind of drop off, but at the end of the day, it's one of these things where it kind of seems to be the middle ground, right? That, as in given Conquest's age, he was kind of in the prime of his life, so to speak, so his healing factor was kind of at its peak, right? We can sort of argue that, kind of present that scenario, but regardless, of course, it's one of these things where Nolan also looks at this situation where it's basically a chance for him to get to know his son Oliver better. And so from there, you basically switch over to a scout ship, right? That's part of the coalition of planets that kind of stumbles across that previous battle that we saw between Battle Beast and a couple other forces, only to find that Battle Beast has actually survived the experience, right? He's frozen in space, but he's basically survived. The other part of this is you have Thaddeus, who meets up with these aliens. Now, I've kind of left these guys out just because of the fact that, I felt like it was a little too much to throw in there in the previous videos, but these guys are kind of like the intelligence hub, right? They're the nervous system, more or less, of the coalition of planets. Essentially, the ability for the coalition to unify and to operate on multiple fronts goes through these guys, right? Like they have almost complete and total knowledge of the operational procedures of the coalition of planets. They become very important here. And the reason why is because the information they give is that at the end of the day, they don't know exactly where it is that Nolan and all these guys are at. Alan the Alien, Tech Jacket, Mark, Oliver, they don't have any information on where those guys are. But what they do know is that the Viltrumites have basically, like, they really initiated the first strike. The Viltrumites are responding and the war's already begun. And so the response of Thaddeus is, okay, fine. Like, if what you guys are waiting for is to give the final word, to basically initiate the initial assault, then I give it, right? And so officially, the coalition of planets has now struck against the Viltrumite Empire, and the war just kind of continues on. The reality is it already started, but this is really kind of like the full-scale conflict taking place, right? So initially with Mark and all them, we were talking about like the invasion of Poland, right? Now we're talking about England and France declaring war against Germany. That's where we're at now, right? Like we're really at like, okay, like the meat and potatoes of this have really started, and there is no going back here. And so what you get are these really interesting juxtapositions between Oliver and Nolan and the coalition of planets, right? That Oliver and Nolan don't know the whole conflict has really grown to the size that it has, where the coalition of planets has officially launched its strike against Viltrumite, and the two factions are now in a full-blown war. They don't know that, right? Like they're totally unaware of that. And in reality, they probably don't care. Not because the war effort's unimportant, but because tending to Mark is more important. And so it's kind of this funny thing, because it's only been a couple of weeks and you end up having like this weird looking alien thing that's killed by Nolan, and Oliver's, he's like, aren't you like starving? And Oliver's like, no, like, I mean, I am, but I'm not hungry enough to eat that thing. And Nolan's like, okay, we'll see what's up. And then like you immediately switch to Oliver just crushing this, right? Like parental knowledge, right? Like kids being proud or kids being foolish. And it's like, okay, I mean, I've been where you are before. That's not going to happen, right? Like you're starving and I promise you're probably going to eat this. And he does. And then he asks for seconds, right? He's like, is there any more? Now, the other part of this is that Alan the Alien basically has a kind of tracking device that emits a high frequency signal that's planted inside of his body that can only really be detected, or seems to only be detected, by the coalition of planets. Most likely because the Viltrumites don't know it's there, so they don't know the frequency to hijack in order to basically deactivate it, interrupt it, basically make it look like he's somewhere that he's not. But because of the fact that the coalition can track it down, you basically have the coalition of worlds that responds with a kind of battalion of sorts that comes descending onto this Viltrumite ship for the purpose of rescuing Alan the Alien and Tech Jacket, right? So they get these guys, they basically start bringing them back, and then you kind of switch back over to Oliver and Nolan, right? And this is a really, really cool moment here, because you have this situation where Oliver asks him the question. He's like, he's like, my mom, not my real mom, right? The insect looking mom, but like my actual Earth mom, right? Debbie, like, do you really think you were in love with her? And it's a really interesting question that this is asked, because one of the great things about Oliver is he's not experienced in the same way that Mark is, right? He still very much sees the world through the eyes of a child, and from the mouth of babes comes truth. And that's really one of the things where he's just kind of asking these questions, because for him, they're legitimately curious and interesting questions. And the response of Nolan is, I know I do. And it's this really interesting scenario where he presents this kind of discussion to her and talks about how he was healing in the Viltrumite prison, in order, and it basically made him realize, yes, he really does care about Debbie. And it's kind of funny because he says that like the Viltrumites themselves, they do have affection, but they don't care for each other in the same way that humans do, right? He says, our lives are so long that over time we grow distant. It's hard to form a bond with someone over that much time. And he says, you'll never find one of us who will admit it, but we live very lonely, solitary lives, especially with our numbers so depleted. Living on Earth changed me. Seeing humans grow so close to each other, caring so deeply for their loved ones in the short amount of time allotted for them, it was special, something to be admired. Now, that's a very important thing to understand when it comes to the Viltrumites. So the reason why is because it's a true statement that Nolan makes here. They live such long lives, but more so than that, that, they're so frequently separated from each other. Unless you're talking about some situation where they come together to face off against some cause, or you need like 3 or 4 who are going to defeat some enemy or something like that, by and large, the Viltrumite Empire does not really operate in giant numbers, right? Because they don't have big numbers. There's less than 100 of them left, right? So you basically have them traveling from world to world for the purpose of conquering it. And it might be one of these things where they kind of hang out, but the reality is any real relationship between one Viltrumite and another is more or less like 2 ships passing in the night. More so than that, with this kind of being the life of Nolan for thousands of years, the sudden change of arriving on Earth and the sudden change of being there and kind of monitoring this place and then having to kind of sneak in and live a quote unquote human life essentially introduced him to aspects of what it meant to live that he'd never really experienced before. Experiencing all those things completely and totally changed him, because what it did is it introduced the idea that there is such a thing as caring about something more than you care about yourself. And that's really what he says. He says, like, I never looked at life as a chore. He says, over time, I fell into the role of human husband, human father, so much so that when Mark got his powers, it was a great burden more than anything. He said, I had to go back to being a Viltrumite. I had to do what I was put there to do, whether I wanted to or not. I spent a lot of time alone, then considering if I could ignore my duty, continue living the lie I'd enjoyed so much with the woman I'd grown to love. He just wanted to kind of enjoy his life, and that's why you never really saw Nolan doing things like destroying the Guardians of the Globe at a much earlier point in time, because in reality, the life that he was living was the life that he wanted, because it was new and it was fresh, but more so than that, it was meaningful. And then suddenly Mark comes along, Mark has powers, and it's like, okay, so now I have to, like, he was basically reminded of what he was supposed to do, and then he went back to being a Viltrumite, but didn't want to, right? He didn't want to, but at the end of the day, the idea was if he doesn't conquer the world, the Viltrumite Empire will come there and they will take it, right? One way or another, the Earth is going to be conquered. But then suddenly when he's separated from it all and he realizes how much he loved his wife, he realizes how much his son meant to him, then basically it turns into, then who cares about the Viltrumite Empire, right? Like, I will take that risk. I will turn against them and we will do the best we can. And so again, kind of getting this sort of juxtaposition, this back and forth, you have this really cool thing where you have Oliver talking with Nolan, the two of them conversing, the two of them sort of learning more about each other. But even this realization that's given to Oliver on behalf of Nolan, which is that the truth is that a kind of merger between a Viltrumite and different races can actually produce a more powerful offspring than simply just Viltrumites by themselves, right? That hybrid physiology can potentially create an incredibly powerful offspring. Now, the reality of this is Mark is really the more powerful out of them, right? Because Mark is a blend between a human and a Viltrumite. And as we were previously told, the compatibility between Viltrumites and humans is big, right? So much so that it's almost perfect. And so kind of these two guys talking back and forth and really kind of enjoying this sort of simplicity of this life that they have, even if it's only minor, right? Just basically eating, living, talking, making sure Mark's protected, is an extreme juxtaposition to Alan the Alien and the coalition of planets fighting these Viltrumites, fleeing for their lives, fighting again over and over and over again, right? Peace versus war. That's really what you're seeing here. And it's kind of interesting to see this thing because you also have Nolan who's basically giving Oliver fighting lessons, who's teaching him, you know, the level of strength that he truly has, how powerful he can become, helping him grow that strength, in a lot of ways doing the things that he didn't quite do for Mark. And that's the nature of what it means to be a parent. It's not as though Nolan hated Mark. It's not as though he despised him. It's simply just that as a parent, when you have your first kid, you're going to screw up consistently. It's only when you get your second kid that you basically correct the mistakes you made with your first kid, but then you end up making whole new mistakes. And so there really is no such thing as a parent, as a time that comes when you simply have a child and you make no mistakes and you raise them perfectly. But for Nolan, he's basically making up for a lot of the things he didn't do with Mark, and he's basically doing that with Oliver, which is cool because he's kind of continuing to learn and to kind of experience this whole thing. And so again, cheering his son on, rooting his son on, it's also kind of switching over to Thaddeus and this revelation that one, Battle Beast has agreed to join their ranks, right? So Battle Beast is fighting alongside the ranks of the Coalition of Planets, which is awesome because this guy's powerful enough to take out Viltrumites. The other part of this is that for some reason, they can't quite seem to gain a foothold in the way that they want to. That while the Viltrumites aren't necessarily able to counter every single move they make, it seems like the Viltrumites have an inside man. And we've known about that for quite some time, that even Thaddeus himself said, there's a spy in the Coalition of Worlds that's feeding information to the Viltrumite Empire. We don't know who this person is, we don't know why they're doing it, but basically it seems as though the Viltrumites always know what's going on. And that's why they should be gaining a much stronger foothold in this war than they are. It's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. Sure, it's a 1-step net gain, but at the end of the day, from Thaddeus's perspective, it should be 2 or 3, right? They should be making far more advances and a much bigger stride in this war than there currently are. So the ultimate or the only real thing for him to do is, because of the fact that they're missing Nolan and they're missing Invincible and they're missing Oliver, right? The only real thing they can do, because they're missing these heavy hitters, is to basically split up Tech Jacket and Alan the Alien, because while they are able to work effectively together, they might be equally effective, but even possibly even more effective by being separated. And so because of that, you kind of switch over to Mark, and Mark just kind of waking up, and ultimately Nolan's like, okay, cool, it won't be long now. We have about another month or so before all this starts to, before Mark basically fully recovers. So again, we're talking about like 2 or 3 months before, between the time that Mark was like severely injured to the point that Mark starts to wake up and Mark can basically recover and get back into the conflict again. Now, under any normal circumstance, there are advanced ways of healing a person, right? There's advanced ways of pulling that off. The problem is Mark's in a highly vulnerable state. So one, they can't fly to the Coalition of Worlds because it's simply too far away. And two, even if they could, the likelihood of them being attacked by the Viltrumites along the way is very, very high. And so because of that, that's why their best bet was to simply stay put. So in truth, the recovery time of Mark could have been cut down to a couple weeks or possibly even days. Given the nature of the circumstance that they're in, they got to let him recover naturally. Now, the funny thing is that there's another reason why Nolan's doing this, right? Why he's having Mark recover the hard way as opposed to the easy way. And we'll find out what that is later on down the line. But what you end up doing here is switching over to the home world of the Viltrumites to, of course, as you guys call him, Freddie Mercury. You guys love calling the leader of the Viltrumites Freddie Mercury. You guys are so sure that's the name of this guy. And honestly, we just need to go with it, right? Like Freddie Mercury. I can guarantee when this guy's revealed in the show, they're gonna call him Freddie Mercury, right? They're gonna be like, yeah, man, Thragg is definitely Freddie Mercury. Like, it's gonna be Freddie Mercury memes all over the place. And I am so looking forward to it. But we end up finding out that the information that's being fed to the Viltrumite Empire is actually coming from one of the aliens that's basically part of the Coalition of Planets nervous system, right? The entire unification, the entire organized military front passes through them. And so because of that, they're in the best position to pass information to Thragg. This is what's basically crippling the war effort of the Coalition of Planets. This guy's just dumping information all the time. And so what ends up happening is we basically have this kind of back and forth between these guys, and Thragg goes as far as to say, you've been feeding us information for years, but it's not enough. We're still losing planets to the Coalition. This is unacceptable. We will strike the Coalition headquarters on Telestria. You will shut down their defenses at the time that's being transmitted to you. Respond. And the answer to this guy is, it will be done, right? And that's when the other guy's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, we're basically going to set the stage for the Viltrumites to conquer the Coalition of Planets. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.